In just one night, the East Sea, a body of water that had been peaceful for centuries, suddenly turned into hell. The sky was red with hundreds of fireballs falling from the sky. Under the water, giant steel monsters began to move. And at the center of that storm was Cambodia, a small country that suddenly became the center of the war between two superpowers, China and the United States. From the coral reefs of the Spratly Islands, the alarm sirens sounded as if tearing the dawn apart. Each radar scanned in circles, reflecting blue light on the tense faces of the officers on duty. It was 5:12 a.m. On the screen appeared dozens of signals, moving from the north. The Chinese Navy's warship formation entered the area considered Cambodia's exclusive economic zone. 17 destroyers of the 55D type, 6 heavy aircraft carriers of the 76 type, and more than 50 escort ships formed a giant steel nose heading straight towards the south of the East Sea. At the Sihanoukville Naval Base, Brigadier General Samara, commander of Cambodia's Maritime Defense Force, could not believe his eyes. Just 3 days ago, Beijing had announced its annual offshore military exercises. No one expected that just one night those ships would change course and attack, crossing the international maritime boundary and approaching Cambodian waters. All communications were disrupted, and signals from U.S. satellites were suddenly cut off as if a giant electronic curtain was covering the entire sea. Samdara gripped the armrests of his chair, gave a hoarse command, and activated the Ratana 2 maritime defense system to send an emergency signal to the coalition command at Wam. Outside, small patrol boats rushed out to sea, their hulls shaking violently from the large waves. The sky was heavy gray. But looming on the horizon were massive black shadows approaching each steel monster with the red star symbol on its hull. 6 a.m., China officially announced a limited military response on the grounds that Cambodia violated their strategic influence zone. But no one believed that it was limited. In a few minutes, dozens of DF-17 missiles were launched from platforms located on Hainan Island, creating long streaks of light across the sky, targeting the Shan Nukview base and the surrounding waters. At the same time, 2,000 kilometers away, the U.S. Pacific Command received an urgent SOS signal. Admiral Matt Reeves, commander of the 7th Fleet, stood in front of a digital map, on which red dots representing Chinese ships were densely packed around Cambodia. He looked up, his voice low and concise. Deploy Operation Iron Mirror, do not let the East Sea be swallowed. Operation Iron Mirror, the rapid response plan that Washington had prepared for the past 2 years, was officially activated in 15 minutes. The 2 aircraft carriers USS Zero Ford and USS Roosevelt, along with 36 F-35C fighters, headed southwest. From Okinawa, 12 B-2 Spirit strategic bombers took off silently, each carrying dozens of GPU-57 stealth bombs. Meanwhile, at the Cambodian base, there were only a few dozen old patrol boats and 2 small Dara-class frigates. But what they had was spirit. They knew that if China occupied the coast, Cambodia would become a new strategic springboard and the East Sea would be completely unbalanced. At 7:15 a.m., the sea south of Truong Sa suddenly exploded. The first DF-17 missile fell just 3 nautical miles from the Shukville base. The explosion created a column of water hundreds of meters high, and waves crashed into the shore like hammers. The entire area shook, screams, sirens, and the sound of crushed metal mixed together into a chaotic symphony. However, the new Israeli-supported Arrow 2KH air defense system was activated in time. Each interceptor rocket flew up, leaving fiery orange trails in the morning mist. 6 of the 8 DF-17s were intercepted in midair, the remaining 2 exploded over the sea, causing minimal damage. Samara was breathing heavily, his hands were sweaty, but there was a proud gleam in his eyes. We are still standing. In the Beijing Command Center, General Jiao Ming, head of the Chinese Navy Operations Department, looked at the giant radar screen where hundreds of signals were flashing, and he growled. Expand the combat area, activate the electronic wolf pack, let them know what technological warfare is. Soon after, a series of electronic interference signals spread like an invisible storm. Cambodia's radar system lost contact for a few minutes. Radio waves were bent, data was distorted. From the hidden launchers in the Tape 39 submarine, the supersonic guided torpedoes rushed underwater, aiming straight at the ram base. At 8 a.m., the first signal from the U.S. 7th Fleet appeared in the air. A formation of 12 F-35Cs flew low along the waves, skimmed the radar interference area, then suddenly accelerated to fire a series of tomahawks, accurately attacking the underground launchers near Phu Lam Island. Giant fireballs erupted in the middle of the sea, sending smoke columns hundreds of meters high. Under the surface water, a Chinese submarine was hit directly. The hull broke in two, the waves pushed away pieces of red-hot steel. Admiral R.S. observed the satellite image transmitted. He clenched his fist, said softly, "One has sunk," continued to move forward. On the other side, Beijing officially announced, "The United States has interfered with regional sovereignty. The Chinese Navy will respond fully." Those words appeared on the global news screen, making the whole world hold its breath. In Washington, the U.S. President appeared in the Situation Briefing Room. His face was cold as steel. He only said one sentence. "Freedom of the seas is non-negotiable. Freedom of navigation cannot be negotiated." At 8:45 a.m., the entire South China Sea was shaken by 42 cruise missiles launched simultaneously from the aircraft carrier Usfert. The goal was to neutralize China's command system on Hainan Island. Light flashed, the sea surface was as bright as day. The shockwaves traveled dozens of kilometers and hit the ship's side, causing water to surge. In an instant, the sky was dyed with blood and fire. Below, the Cambodian soldiers were still fighting desperately. The frigate Kilian was hit, its hull tilted, and water rushed in. The young Captain Phaidon, who once dreamed of becoming a musician, shouted loudly in the alarm siren. "Don't leave the ship, return fire." The last shells were fired and shot straight into the giant black shadow in the distance. A Type 55D destroyer. In an instant, the shell hit the auxiliary ammunition compartment, causing a chain explosion. Fire broke out, the Chinese ship tilted to the left side. Cheers rang out in the inferno. But that short-lived joy was immediately extinguished when 4 EJ-18 anti-ship missiles rushed in. One missed, two exploded on the water. But the fourth pierced the KH Lion's hull. Light flashed for the last time. Then the ship broke apart in a sea of fire, the water roared as if swallowing all sound. Cambodia lost contact with the last warship in the front line. But at that moment, a signal came from the United States on the emergency frequency. This was the USS Roosevelt. We were in the area holding our position. The real battle had begun. By 9 a.m., the South China Sea was on fire, the water boiling with thousands of pieces of metal falling from the sky. Black smoke billowed up like giant snakes, blocking out the sun. The sound of jet engines, the explosion of missiles, and the roar of the sea combined into a chaotic symphony that only war can create. In the air, the U.S. Navy's F-35C formation divided into three clusters, moving in AV formation at an altitude of 10 meters. Under the sea, two Virginia-class submarines, USS Illinois and USS Delaware, quietly approached the combat zone. Sona picked up the metallic sound of a Chinese submarine west of the Spratly Islands. Admiral R.S. gave a brief order to fire before they could detect us. Below was a murky water. Two MX-48 torpedoes were launched, traveling at a speed exceeding 100 kilometers. 18 seconds later, the sonar screen showed only a loud bang and then silence. A Chinese submarine, Tai 309, had been completely sunk. Above, the F-35CS flew through low clouds, dropping a series of JBU-39 guided bombs at the battleship formation protecting the aircraft carrier Lu Ning. The Aegis defense system on the U.S. destroyers was in constant operation. The radar scanned in circles like the eyes of the sea god. On the ground, the officers coordinated battlefield data through the Spirit 16 satellite system, drawing a real-time map, a maze of arrows, fire lines and moving red dots. From the deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carrier, the Yellow Lake commanding officer unlocked Storm Battery, and immediately 40 Tomahawk missiles were fired, flying out like bright spears. The sky lit up again, the sea north of Cambodia shook, one of them hit the destroyer Type 55D number 124 directly. The Chinese ship's hull exploded in the middle of the ammunition compartment. The flames rolled like a roaring steel dragon. At the command base on Hainan Island, General Zhao Min slammed his hand on the table. He shouted to activate the counterattack. DF-27 fired all. Immediately after that, 12 DF-27 hypersonic missiles left the launch pad and headed towards the U.S. aircraft carriers. They moved so fast that the radar could only record faint orange streaks. On the Roosevelt, the Aegis defense system reacted immediately. Dozens of SM-6 interceptors were launched, creating a giant fire net in the sky. The continuous explosions tore through the space. 10 DF-207s were destroyed, but two passed through the defense net. One exploded at a distance of 3 nautical miles. The shock wave hit the side of the ship, shaking the entire boom system. Water rushed up, dozens of sailors fell, blood mixed with the seawater. In Cambodia, General Samara received a signal for reinforcements from the U.S. The radar system was temporarily restored. Green dots representing allies appeared. He stared at the screen, speaking softly like a prayer. They had arrived. At Ramport, the remaining Cambodian forces, by small patrol boats, 3 shore missile systems formed a final defense cave. The young soldiers, mostly just a few pairs of tens, stood amid the sirens and gunfire. Their eyes reflected the light of each distant explosion. At 9:40, on the sea surface 80 kilometers away from Dream, a formation of B-2 Spirit bombers appeared. They flew high, making no sound like ghosts. Each one carried 10 smart bombs to attack through the ship's hull. When the fire signal sounded, the sky lit up again. 12 bombs fell, piercing through the thick clouds and straight into the Chinese aircraft carrier formation. One hit the stern of the Lu Ning, causing the auxiliary fuel tank to explode. The fire flared up fiercely and spread throughout the deck. The F-35C pilot high above clearly saw the flames rising hundreds of meters high. A voice rang out on the radio. "Uncle, the Dragon is burning." On the Beijing side, the information system was heavily jammed. The mobile command stations lost contact. The long-range radar was completely blurred, but instead of retreating, they activated the electronic Wolfpack plan, using 6 Type 52D destroyers as sources of extremely strong electric pulses, creating a huge interference field in the electronic space. Immediately, the radar signals of the US and Cambodia were blurred. The battlefield map became a chaotic mess of flashing dots. An American pilot shouted over the radio, "We are blind, there is no more radar image." Admiral R calmly ordered, switched to optical observation mode, activated the Ghost Creed system. In fact, Ghost Creed is an AI system that simulates flight paths, predicting the enemy's movement direction based on virtual data. In 20 seconds, the reconstructed map displayed ghosts of enemy ships. The pilots relied on it to fire bullets along the predicted trajectory. A reckless decision, but it saved the entire formation. More than 60% of the Chinese firepower was blocked in midair. At sea, the American submarines continued to operate in silence. The USS Delaware detected 2 Thai 319B submarines lurking near the Cambodian shore. A chase in the darkness began. At a depth of 300 meters, the water was as cold as ice. The sonar sounded rhythmically like a heartbeat. The target was approaching at a distance of 900 meters. The technician reported to the commander and gave a brief order to launch. The 2 torpedoes launched silently for 5 seconds. A loud explosion shook the seabed. The darkness was bright for a moment, then everything fell into silence. On the surface of the water, the burned hulls drifted among the waves. The black smoke rose high, the fire reflected on the water like sparkling blood. Each wave carried pieces of metal, life jackets, and pieces of the half-burned hull. In the distance, the Receivant's hull was still glowing in the gray smoke like a giant floating fortress. Admiral RPS stood silently in front of the screen, his voice low. "If the South China Sea is not free today, the whole world will lose it tomorrow." On the other side, General Goyo Ming was silent. He looked through the glass window of the command room, where the sun was slowly sinking behind the smoke. In the red sunset, he knew that this war had gone beyond calculation. Reports appeared one after another. Liaoning was heavily damaged, 3 destroyers lost contact, 2 submarines lost signal. Under his palm, the map of the South China Sea was soaked with sweat. On the deck of the USS Roosevelt, the alarm sounded again. Engineers were reloading missiles, soldiers were supplying ammunition, nurses were taking care of the wounded right below deck. At this chaotic sound, a seriously injured Cambodian soldier was brought up by rescue helicopter. He saw the American flag fluttering in the smoke, then closed his eyes and said softly, "We have not lost." The sky of the South China Sea was now glowing like a second sun. The war had turned the entire ocean into a burning iron field. But in the hearts of the small people in the storm, the fire of will has not yet been extinguished. They no longer fight for orders but for a single belief that freedom is not a gift given but something to be won. Every inch of wave, every drop of blood. At 9:50 a.m., the East Sea was submerged in smoke and the sound of engines. The water surface was dyed a thick gray, no longer distinguishable from waves, smoke, or blood. The waves hitting the ship's hull created a dry sound, echoing like the sound of ocean drums. At a depth of more than 250 meters where light could not reach, The giant war machines were still moving silently and deadly like wounded animals. The USS Delaware quietly moved deep south. Sona picked up the unusual metallic echoes of the enemy submarine's engine, mixed with the sound of the torpedo loading system. 1,200 meters away, the target was slowing down, probably 39. The Sona engineer whispered. No one in the hold said a word. All eyes were on the display screen. The commander leaned over to give the order, preparing to fire 2 MA-48s. Absolute silence, black and red in the hold flashing. The 2 torpedoes left the launch tube and sailed away in silence. A minute later, a dull explosion echoed through the water. The Sona screen showed dozens of pieces of metal debris. A Chinese submarine had just been torn apart, but Delaware did not stop. They knew that in the deeper darkness there were at least 3 more plating shadows lurking. An unusually strong signal was detected north of U.S. Illinois. The audio track was long and stable, too stable for a submarine. It was not an engine, it was an electronic decoy. The radar officer noticed, but the discovery came too late. 2 torpedoes suddenly came from the east, one grazed the side of the ship, the other hit the stern and exploded the auxiliary compartment. The whole hull shook violently, the lights in the compartment flashed continuously, and water began to flood in. The captain shouted, closed the emergency valve, and lowered the depth to 400 meters. The USS Illinois tilted to the left and shook violently. Under the terrible pressure of the seawater, the screeching sound of metal rang out terrifyingly, but they still maintained control. After 20 seconds of tense silence, the commander gritted his teeth and gave the order. In return, 2 M48s were launched. A huge explosion lit up the entire ocean floor for a few seconds, and the enemy was wiped out. While the ghosts under the sea were fighting silently on the surface, the US and Cambodian forces began to recoordinate. From the command base on the Rausvan, a unified data signal was transmitted via military satellite. The battlefield map was constantly updated, showing the position of each unit. Dodo Riss noticed something unusual. All the Chinese warships were turning south, no longer in encirclement formation. They were pulling forces down near Indonesia's Natuna Island. Why? In Beijing, General Jiaming was making a desperate move. Operation Phantom Dragon was activated using JL-3 nuclear submarines with a range of over 9 kilometers. Their target was not Cambodia, but to send a direct threat message to Washington. We can strike all the way to the U.S. mainland. In the underground control room deep under Hainan Island, engineers worked quickly on the control panel. The screen read launch preparation complete 80%. At the Pentagon, the NORAD's early warning system detected unusual heat activity from that area. The U.S. president was immediately brought into the strategy room, no longer a tactical game. An advisor whispered, if they really launched, this would be the beginning of a world war. The president looked straight at the screen, his voice resolute. Stop it at all costs. At 9:58 a.m., the USS Roosevelt activated its AIS Block 2A strategic defense system, launching 12 SM-3 interceptors from the destroyer USS Porter. In the sky, the intersecting orbits created an unprecedented space battle. A flash of light appeared in the thick clouds. The sensor signaled a successful interception. Z-3 was destroyed in the lower atmosphere, more than 70 kilometers above sea level. The entire command post was broken into cheers, but no one smiled because they knew that was just the beginning of a life-and-death game. At the same time, south of the Truong Sa archipelago, a formation of MQ-25 and XQ-508A Valkyrie drones appeared. They flew at low altitude, moving in a waveform that emitted fake interference pulses, aiming to attract enemy fire. Behind them, for real F-35C fighters were quietly approaching. When the Chinese radar system was ignited, 4 wire-guided bombs were dropped precisely at the center of the escort ship formation. 4 bombs exploded at the same time, the sea shook, a Chinese destroyer was split in 2, flames rising higher than cotton. At Ram Base, Cambodian soldiers looked up at the bright sky. They knew their allies were fighting for them. In the smoke, Samara stood on the command deck, his voice hoarse. When dragons fight, the weak are often crushed. But today we will stand. The radio signal passed through many layers of interference to Roosevelt. Ripes heard every word clearly. He replied, "You are not alone." 10:20. The sea suddenly became strangely quiet, no more engine noise, no more tearing waves, only smoke, fire, and the smell of burning oil. Suddenly, the entire sea east of Phu Quoc Island lit up. The last 3 Chinese DF-27 missiles left the launch pad. But this time they were not aimed at warships, they were headed straight for the Grim area, the center of Cambodia's defense. Admiral R immediately ordered a full-scale interception. 2 SM-6s were launched, accompanied by 4 AO-2 surface-to-air missiles from the Cambodian coast. In the sky, streaks of light intersected. 1 DF-20 was shot down, the second deviated and exploded in the sea. The last one continued to fly. In the ram base, the alarms sounded, and civilians and soldiers rushed to the bunkers. The explosion occurred only 3 kilometers from shore. The shock wave shook the entire city, shattered glass, and collapsed roofs. But the miracle was that the main defense system was still intact. When the smoke cleared, shouts rang out from the bunkers. "We are still alive." On the deck of the Roosevelt, Reeves listened to the report and bowed his head in silence. He knew that this war was no longer just between the United States and China. It had become a symbol of the will to survive of an entire sea. In Beijing, General Zhao Min stood still in front of the screen. The advisors around him were silent. A young officer trembled and said, "Sir, Liaoning is sinking." Zhao Min closed his eyes and said nothing. He understood that the dragon they were proud of was being dragged to the bottom of the ocean. And in that moment, perhaps he also realized that victory no longer belonged to the strong, but to the one who dared to stand firm in the storm. At sea, the sky began to rain, the rain mixed with the gunfire, extinguishing the fires that were still smoldering. The waves rolled up, carrying the wreckage and the faint light of the last flares. In the distance, the sun had not yet risen, leaving only a halo of light on the horizon. In that brief silence, Riff's voice rang out over the radio. This was not a victory, this was a warning to all of us. And then, deep under the sea, the USS Day radar picked up a weak signal. Another submarine was still alive, still moving. The underwater war was not over, the Ghost was still drifting in the deep, where the light of peace could not reach. At 10:45 a.m., the rain gradually became heavier, covering the eastern sea in a gloomy gray color. Columns of black smoke rose from the ship, mingling with the clouds, forming a thick curtain that obscured the horizon. In that cold, humid atmosphere, the war had not yet ended. It had only temporarily held its breath like a giant beast preparing for its final attack. On the deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the black burn marks were still clearly evidence of the previous attack. Engineers ran along the metal corridor, replacing bullet cores, checking the radar while medics urgently bandaged the wounded right under the boom. The smell of beard, smoke and blood mixed together to create an indescribable scent, the smell of war. Admiral Matthew Revere, his eyes glued to the electronic map. He knew Beijing would not accept it. A new report had just arrived. Japanese radar detected 3 other groups of Chinese warships moving from the north, passing through the Luz 1 Strait towards the East Sea, a total of more than 80 ships, and there are 2 new aircraft carriers. Riff clenched his fists. He understood that this was no longer a local battle. This was a full-scale escalation. At the same time, in Washington, the U.S. President convened the National Security Council. In the room, the light from the satellite screen shone on the tense faces of the generals. The National Security Advisor reported that China was sending 2 more air defense brigades from Guangdong and expanding the combat zone to the western Pacific. The president's voice was hoarse. If they crossed the 110-degree line, we would be forced to react. There was a long silence. No one spoke, but everyone understood. Reacting meant disaster. On the sea, the 7th Fleet and the Cambodian army were reorganizing. The surviving Cambodian units retreated to shore, forming a defensive line around the rim. Seahawk helicopters circled like steel birds, rescuing survivors from sunken ships. The sea water was stained with black oil and red blood. In the distance, the wreck of the Liaoning was still smoldering. The giant ship's hull tilted to one side like a piece of torn steel. Weak distress signals rang out from the Chinese radio, but no one dared to approach. In Beijing, General Jiao Ming held an emergency meeting with his senior commanders in a deep underground bunker. The screen before them displayed devastating satellite images, Liaoning burning, more than 30 ships sunk. A young officer said, his voice trembling, "Sir, the soldiers' morale is plummeting. If we don't counterattack, they will collapse." Jia Min was silent for a long time and then said, "Counterattack? We will counterattack, but not just with artillery shells." The cold old man launched the Dragon Rain operation using a new generation of electromagnetic pulse weapons that could paralyze all electronic systems within a 500 kilometers radius. At 11 a.m., A missile carrying an EMP warhead was launched from the mainland towards the center of the East Sea. It flew low, only a few hundred meters above the water surface, passing through the rain clouds. When it exploded, there was no light, no fire, just an invisible wave spreading out. In an instant, the radar system of the 7th Fleet went dark. The screens went black, the radio signal disappeared. All communication between Roosevelt and Delaware was cut off. The pilots flying high above saw only a sea of white clouds and absolute silence. "We are completely blind," an officer shouted. Rips gritted his teeth and turned on the backup power, activating Ecosil. Ecosil was an emergency defense system, operating independently with the main electronic network, but it could only last 20 minutes. In the darkness of technology, the two sides now relied only on instinct and real fighting skills. Under the sea, the USS Delaware continued to move silently. No radar, no sonar, only sound. The sonar engineer put his ear to the stethoscope, clearly hearing the distant engine noise. A large formation of 80-12 ships was moving south. The captain lowered his voice. "This is the only chance to shoot all the torpedoes." Inside the launch tube, 12 48mm torpedoes were activated. Within 3 minutes, 12 flashes of light spread from the seabed, connecting like a chain of lightning. 6 Chinese warships were hit, 2 of them completely exploded. For the first time since the beginning of the battle, the deep sea echoed with the sound of victory. High above, when the Ecosil system had recovered 30% of the data, Rips noticed that hundreds of new signals appeared on the map, not only from China but also from the Indian Ocean. The Asian Military Alliance headed by India and Japan had just sent a message. "We are mobilizing peace support forces to the East Sea." Rips sighed. Peace fish. He thought to himself, in this world, peace always comes with guns. The rain was still falling heavily, the wind whipped against the deck, carrying wet maps. An information officer ran in, shouting, "Sir, China's satellite signals are increasing in strength. They may be preparing to launch a second missile." Rips looked out to sea, where the sky had darkened. He spoke slowly, word by word. "Then we will also show them the power of the sky." From the deck of the USS Roosevelt, 2 squadrons of F-315CS took off in the rain. The rainwater was ignited by the jet, creating a white mist behind them. Above, they broke away from the formation and rushed towards the increasing electronic signals. Behind the UAVs that followed like invisible kites on the ground, the Cambodian coastal defense laser system lit up, sending red rays into the sky. It was the first time it had been activated in real combat. When the 2 streams of fire met, the whole sky exploded in lightning. Missiles and guided bombs all merged together. The East Sea turned into a sea of fire. Another DF-27 was hit, breaking apart in midair. The falling debris created a rain of metal that pierced the clouds. An F-35C was hit by shrapnel and spun around, but the pilot managed to eject. Although the fire was still burning, Ripes did not take his eyes off the screen. He knew this was the decisive moment. In Beijing, General Zhao Min received a series of messages. Communication with the Southern Fleet was lost. The second DF-27 launcher was destroyed. He slammed his hand on the table. "Impossible, how were they doing it?" An advisor replied in a trembling voice. "The Americans are using self-learning tactical AI. It predicts our every move." Jiao Ming paused. He looked at the map and smiled sadly. One day, humans will be defeated by their own intelligence. At 11:40 the rain stopped. Only smoke and faint flames remained on the sea surface. The Chinese fleet had lost more than 60% of its force. Liaoning had completely sunk to the bottom of the sea. Cambodia was still standing, but its coast was devastated. Roosevelt and Delaware were still operating, but they had run out of fuel and hundreds of sailors had been awarded. Admiral Riffes looked through the glass window where the pale sunlight shone down. He knew that another battle was coming, not about shells but about decisions that would shape the world. He turned to his assistant liaison officer with Washington. It was time to make the final choice. And on the other side of the world in Beijing, Jiao Ming gave the same order. Prepare for Phase 2. If they advance a mile, show the world what true darkness is. 11:55 a.m. The East Sea of Musong. But beneath the smoke, the faint glow of war still smoldered. Pieces of drifting hulls reflected the pale light of the obscured sun. Everything seemed to slow down as if the ocean itself were holding its breath, waiting for something that would decide the fate of the entire region. On the USS Roosevelt, the radio was only a faint crackle. The sailors looked silently up at the gray sky, where each missile had drawn bright lines of destruction. Admiral Matthew Ripps stood still, his face smeared with smoke, his gaze turned to the east, where the dawn light had never been so weak. "We've gone too far," he whispered, but we couldn't stop. On the Cambodian coast, General Samara stepped out of the command bunker. Before him, the rim dock was a pile of rubble. Burned buildings, overturned tanks, and tired soldiers still clutching their guns. On the muddy ground, the Cambodian flag still fluttered in the smoke, half torn but still refusing to fall. He raised his head and looked up, his voice low but firm. "This land, even if it burns, is still ours." At 12:15 p.m., from the north, the Chinese satellite signal appeared again. A new formation of warships was moving quickly, not following the usual navigation route. They carried tactical nuclear devices, a weapon that had not been used since World War II. In Beijing, General Zhao Min knew the meaning of this order: victory at any cost. But he also knew that if that bomb fell, not only the East Sea but the whole world would burn. He looked at the screen displaying the image of the Cambodian coastline. "Small but resilient people. They are not our enemies," he muttered. "We are just pawns on a very large chessboard." After a moment of silence, he grabbed the phone and ordered all nuclear launches to stop and prepare for negotiations. But at the same time, before the signal could be transmitted, a Chinese autonomous destroyer, an unmanned system controlled by tactical AI, was still performing its pre-programmed mission. It had gone beyond human control. Below the deck, the computer system coldly displayed the words "Target Lock, Launch in Progress." 2 tactical nuclear missiles were launched towards the center of the East Sea. On the Roosevelt, the alarm sounded, the screen showed 2 red dots rushing towards the center of the East Sea. Riff gave the command, activating all interception systems. Dozens of SM-3 missiles were launched, forming a crisscrossing network of light across the sky. One was destroyed high up, the other fell off and exploded in midair, creating a huge electromagnetic explosion. The whole sky was white for a few seconds, then everything went dark. The electronic systems went dark. Every ship was plunged into absolute darkness. In that darkness, there was only the sound of waves and human breathing. Riss leaned on the control panel and spoke softly through the intercom. "No more radar, no more missiles, nothing. But we still have hearts." On the other side, Sarah replied hoarsely, "And human will had no off button." At 1300 hours, the sunlight gradually penetrated the smoke, revealing the East Sea as a panorama of ship fragments, oil slicks, and drifting rescue parachutes. No one knew who had won, no one thought about winning anymore. In Beijing, Zhao Min was isolated from the command system, but he smiled slightly when he heard that all the missiles had stopped. In Washington, the U.S. President announced a halt to all military operations and called for immediate peace negotiations. Riff stepped onto the deck of the ship, looking out at the horizon, a lost seagull flying in the smoke over the wrecks and disappearing into the mist. He said softly, "We have protected freedom but lost peace. Perhaps true victory is when no one has to die for it." On the Cambodian coast, children were brought out of their hiding place. They looked up at the sky, seeing the dim sunlight through the clouds. A child asked the soldier next to him, "Uncle, why is the sun so weak?" The soldier smiled, putting his hand on his shoulder. "Because today the sea cried, but tomorrow it will smile again." The afternoon fell, and the East Sea returned to silence. Gentle waves began to lap at the shore, washing away the debris of steel, fire, and even bright dreams. From afar, the flags of countries were raised at the same time on the red, blue, white, and yellow rescue ships that no longer carried the meaning of confrontation, but a symbol of hope for survival. At the United Nations, a few days later, representatives of the United States, China, and Cambodia signed a ceasefire document called the Red Sea Treaty, which included a short but powerful clause. No country would be allowed to turn the East Sea into a battlefield again, because every wave here had witnessed human blood. In the night when all the television cameras were turned off, Riff sat alone in the command room looking out to sea. Outside, the small lights of the rescue ship flickered like stars lost in the middle of the bed. He gently closed his eyes and muttered, "The sun will rise again. But not today." And out there, in the middle of the red East Sea, each wave gently undulated like a whisper to send off those who had fallen. The ocean was still tolerant after all, it swallowed both war and hatred, leaving only silence.